And we're live again. This is Martin Selbrede on May 16th, 2018. I'm the Vice President of the Chalcedon Foundation, and we're here again for another weekly episode of Chalcedon Q&A and a little meat of the word. We usually allow a little time for our technical team to get us connected, so we'll allow them to do that once I see that they're up and running, and then I'm going to be ready to roll. Now, it's possible I don't see... there she is. Ground Control is with us. Good to have you here, Andrea. Andrea's going to connect us to the chalcedon.edu website, where people can catch up with us right there. Hi, Kelly. They change this interface all the time, so it gets more and more intrusive as I broadcast. But you got to love these folks. Mike, good to have you here. I still owe you a referral to an attorney regarding some of your tragedies with your farm up there in Missouri. So we're good to go. Good afternoon, Mike. We're going to take a couple of questions that were held over from last week, and then one that came in online. Remember, you can send your questions in advance. ask.chalcedon@chalcedon.edu. That gets those things here into our hands, and we normally put them up front. Last week we had a question from Joy Ike, and she was speaking about the law against marrying a wife's sister. And her question was, what are the chances that sisters is to be taken in the more general sense, like not enslaving your brothers in Israel? And if so, if it is taken in the general sense, might not this passage, which is in Leviticus 18:18, be in effect a prohibition against polygamy, despite the fact that polygamy elsewhere looks to be at least regulated in part? So that's a very interesting question. And so I looked into some of the history of the exposition of this passage in Luke 18:18, Leviticus 18:18. We were in Luke 18 with Mark's sermon just a few minutes ago, hence the crossed wires. So up until 1575, sisters was always taken to be the literal flesh and blood sister, literally from the same mom, same mother, from the same womb. In this sister in the narrow sense of what we would mean a sister. And it changed in 1575 when two scholars started to consider a more expansive interpretation. It would be Junius and Tremellius, and that started to appear in translations thereafter. And so we had a basis for going that direction. Now there was more than one option to interpret the verse. And the wider interpretation, which would then be, in essence, a prohibition against at least some form of polygamy, since it would not involve someone outside of Israel necessarily, that actually ends up in Dr. Rushdoony's commentary on Leviticus. He does treat that passage as, in fact, a prohibition on polygamy. And he's not alone in this. John Murray, who taught systematic theology at Westminster Theological Seminary, also held to the position that this was a prohibition against bigamy, having two wives at the same time. So he took sister in the wider sense. Now, the difficulty with this, as pointed out by Gordon Wenham, is significant. And Wenham is an important figure here because his commentary on Leviticus is regarded as one of the most important of the last century. In fact, it is the most cited commentary on Leviticus in Rushdoony's commentary, behind that of Calvin, Knight, Kyle, and others. He cites Wenham more than anyone else. So even Dr. Rushdoony regarded that 1985 work by Wenham as pretty authoritative, or he wouldn't have consulted it as often as he did to get background material for his commentary. So in Wenham's view, it is erroneous to take the sense, he says it really is literal sister, and he gives some interesting theological reasons for that. That is, that the notion of becoming one flesh in marriage is to literally become united with the flesh, the bloodline at that point. So that when you marry a woman who has a sister, you are now also, that person now, the sister, is your sister. And therefore the prohibition against marrying a sister is now in effect. And that, until your wife dies, you may not do that. Now, the Jews preferred to have that arrangement after the death of one of the sisters because it was thought that the sister coming in, the aunt, would have the most natural affection for any children that were still to be raised. So the orphan children would therefore have the benefit of an aunt now becoming their mother and raising them. So this was encouraged in Judaism after the death of the first person, which of course would be a tragedy, but the tragedy was redeemed in their view because the most logical person to step into that position would be the sister, if in fact the husband, the widower, was willing to go ahead and marry her. But that was prohibited until his actual wife had passed away. The only exceptions to some of these rules would be the levirate scenario in Leviticus 25, and so this is called the sororite rule, if you want to call it that. They have a technical term for it. Now, Ginsburg, way back in the 19th century, observed that this idea had other problems, aside from Wenham's objection, that it was actually in effect, a violation of marrying your own sister at that point because of the one flesh creating that new connection that essentially made your wife's sister your sister, at least as long as your wife was alive. And it's this, that there are grammatical problems. One, that the use of the term sister in the preceding verses is always exactly the same. It is the narrow sense, these close relations, as opposed to distant relations, even though there's a point, I think it's in verse 9, where they talked about near kin and distant kindred, or patrilineage, as they say it. And then he made a very profound point. He says, and these verbs that are used, that who is close to you, says the construction there grammatically would be completely wrong if it didn't mean exactly what it seems to mean, which is the literal sister. And he uses several verses in Ezekiel to prove it. Ezekiel 1:9, Ezekiel 1:23, which says the angels, the wings of the cherubim were pointed one to another, and that exact same construction, one to the other, would have been expected in the sense over there in Leviticus 18, and we don't have that. So here we have a divide. There are exegetical, grammatical, philological reasons for saying it literally means the sister, literal sense sister, not in the wider sense. But we have some noted scholars like John Murray and Rushdoony adopting the later view that came on board in 1575, as we mentioned, in regard to, is it the more expansive sense, and therefore restricts certain forms of polygamy. So the answer is, it depends who you want to follow. My personal preference, even though I have the highest respect for Dr. Rushdoony's work, is that the exegetical evidence seems to clinch the idea that it's the literal sister, though I do not take it lightly if I'm going to depart from Dr. Rushdoony's position on a controverted point like that. But it's important to know that that view was unknown to Christendom until 1575, and when Junius and Tremellius put it forward, that sister might not be the restricted sense, but the expansive sense, as implied by the question that Joy sent in. I see she's online now. So that's where we have at the moment. It might be, but it may not be. Then we had a question, was a follow-on from Marissa Hinkle related to David and the number of wives that he had. And we actually dealt with this at some length last week. I don't think it's necessary to go ahead and pursue that any farther, because I focused on the issue of everything that he did was right, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, and I expanded a bit on that and what that entailed. No, Joey, I did not address that, and maybe we will get around to that next week. So, because the issue was, again, the restriction of sister in verse 18. But point taken. It looks like we're going to spend some more time on this issue. But it's an interesting passage, isn't it? Everyone wants to get that right, because these are all the degrees of consanguinity which allow or do disallow marriages. There was a preference, though not a demand, that you married within your tribe, and often even with cousins and things like that, the so-called kissing cousins phenomenon. So the restrictions and the permissions would follow suit. But again, I think even that would, I think Wenham would be right in arguing, because the rivalry there is to vex her, which means that to be a rival wife in that instance. And see, what is being undermined there is the two sisters originally had sisterly love for one another. Now, instead of having sisterly love, they are in competition for the man. And so what had been, in fact, a harmonious love between sisters is now a competition between them. And this is what would therefore be forbidden until one of them, the one who's originally married, passed away. So I hope that at least answers in part your question there. All right, let's see. Roger had asked, you talked about the trial in Numbers 5, verses 11:31, the trial for jealousy, which involved, as Rushdoony points out in his commentary on Numbers, this is not a trial by ordeal at all, because the dust of the temple was obviously benign. It's just a little bit of dust mixed with water. And the only efficacy in it would be that God would be directly acting. And as Roger said, his question, this is obviously an appeal to God. His question continues saying, therefore, what is the practical contemporary application of this passage? Do we simply just hire a detective or something on this order? That's a very interesting point because, of course, it is exactly that. It's an appeal to God, one. Two, we don't have any temple dust handy to do this, do we? But we know this, that the way the transgressor is hard, and that all that is hidden will be revealed, and God in his providence will sort all these things out. And we talked about this last week. We don't have to worry about perfect justice now because perfect justice happens on the day of judgment. All history is heading toward a major reckoning where every account will be set straight, including these particular issues. But because we lack the temple and the temple dust as a consequence, we're not able to literally take and apply Numbers 5 in the way it was dealt with back then. It simply is not going to happen. Now, on the other hand, one could argue this, that as the knowledge of the Lord covers the earth as the waters cover the sea, and the whole land becomes holy, which is the whole mission of Zechariah 14:21. The final verses of Zechariah talk about everything being made holy as the Great Commission nears its completion. Then, in effect, everything is holy ground, and the dust would therefore be suitable for that. On the other hand, at that point in time, how many adulteries and jealousies would there be if we're approaching the final end game under a post-millennial scenario? In fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit with one of the other questions that had popped up. And of course, interesting you mentioned that, Johnny. You said, since we have the heavenly temple, could we not appeal directly to the Lord for judgment? And that appeal to the Lord takes several different forms. Because then you would say, well, if she came down with an illness and her stomach swelled up, then I'm off the hook and I don't have to follow through in the event of a failed test. But the fact of the matter is, under the Numbers 5 proviso, if nothing happened, she was innocent, and he had been accusing a virgin of Israel falsely, and he had consequences for that, for having done so. So how do we measure that out? So you really have a problem that the law had sanctions both directions, positive and negative, and with the appeal to heaven, how would you know at what point you cut off the timing? Saying, I'm still waiting for her belly to swell up. And that starts to sound like nonsense, which ultimately becomes because we're a little bit far afield. But in general, an appeal to heaven, as they call it, usually means we can't settle our differences, say this country and another country. So we're going to go to war and let God settle it, because God will give the victory to the one who's right. And so this appeal to heaven was just justification for all sorts of things that happened just because someone won the war. That meant Rome was in the right and Carthage was in the wrong, for example. And every slaughter that succeeded meant that the victims were in the wrong. That's a very shallow and dangerous reading of history, because God does not operate in so simplistic a way. He has his plans, and they often wind through human catastrophe in the meantime. So, yeah, it would be on the husband to obey, Johnny is correct. So I'll go ahead and get to the final question, which in fact have ground control. Ground control, did you get my email that I sent about half hour before broadcast? If so, or if you can pull it up, I have a link I'd like to post for everyone to take a look at. And this link is from the Journal of Biblical Ethics in Medicine. Now, the journal is no longer operational, but it had a couple of decades run in the 80s and 90s, and it was just uniformly excellent. It was the only thing of its kind. Dr. Edward M. Payne, who we published at the Chalcedon website, thank you, Ground Control. Edward M. Payne spearheaded the journal, and it was there to fill an important gap because no one was dealing with these complex questions in biblical ethics. And so the questions that came by, there were a series of 3 of them, involved the various scientific advances and technological advances that relate to in vitro fertilization and embryo transfers and a whole host of things. And the reason I had Ground Control post this particular link to the journal's article is that in the, I think it was the 5th issue, 3rd volume, there was an excellent article by a lady attorney, and she had a lot of good sources informing her, MDivs and doctors, theologians and doctors, physicians, on her article. And she laid out some rules that need to apply, the 3 principles, she says, that should allow us to fence this issue in a biblically appropriate way. And so this is exactly where the article takes us. So anyone interested in this topic would be benefited and blessed to read the article that was posted there, if not right now since I'm yapping. Afterward, you can pull up the link to this broadcast and click on it and read through. After that, we'll deal with that topic at length next week, question by question, using this as the background, or at least one of the backgrounds. So, by the way, talking about technology getting in advance of our ethics. That's obvious because, they said, okay, we built a nuclear bomb, but now no one knows how to use it. Henry Kissinger famously said, these are weapons in search of a doctrine. And so it is that our technology often outstrips our moral compass to show us how to use our technology. Michael Crichton, when he wrote Jurassic Park, had put the following line approximately into the mouth of his chaotician, Dr. Ian Malcolm. And Malcolm, I think he says to Hammond, the inventor of Jurassic Park, said, you've been so busy trying to see if you could do something, you didn't stop to think if you should do something. The should dimension is the ethical dimension, and that tends to be missed. Simply because science can do something doesn't mean they have the ethical wherewithal to resolve it. That's why we're going to be talking on one of the future Book of the Month clubs, I'll be directing it, on the mythology of science by R.J. Rushdoony, where he points out that the scientists, when they're being coming up for, say, congressional hearings and stuff about nuclear weapons, are shocked to think anyone believes that they're not qualified. In fact, they are the only ones qualified to talk about ethics and science, because they alone can be trusted because their motives are pure. They're into science. And of course, this nonsense passes muster with a lot of folks that believe in scientism and naturalism and materialism. They don't realize that the ethical dimension goes far beyond, and that in fact all these facts are not brute facts, but they are God-created facts, and the only true meaning behind them is the one that God asserts. So justice being the foundation of his throne, ethics is at the core of everything, and we need to grasp that. And I mention this because we see there appears to be this big explosion of technical knowledge across the board, not just in the bioengineering area, which this question dealt with, or 3 questions really, that came in, but just in general. And oftentimes we saw the dispensationalists point to a passage in, I believe it's in Daniel 12, saying, see, here it says, knowledge shall increase. So, and that's what we're having, a huge explosion. Our libraries, our Wikipedias can't hold all the knowledge. It's growing faster than anyone can grasp. The last human being who knew everything there was to know, in the Western world anyway, he died in the 1800s or something like that, or the early 1900s. It was not possible for one man to know everything. So they say, here's proof that we're near the end of the world, the catastrophic, apocalyptic end of the world, because knowledge shall increase, and we've fulfilled this prophecy of Daniel 12. In actual fact, and this is interesting to me, this notion of knowledge that's in Daniel 12 is very similar to that laid out in Isaiah 11. The knowledge of the Lord shall cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. What is being depicted there in all likelihood in Daniel 12 is a knowledge of God, a saving knowledge of God covering the world. That knowledge shall increase, knowledge of who God is and people responding to him properly. That's the kind of knowledge that is legitimately an indication that things might be running to a close, that God's great commission is being completed. So it's a whole different ballgame at that point. All right, Joy has another question here. Let me see if I can see the entirety of it. Yes, it looks like I can get 6 lines. Joy writes, that is, how can we rely upon the law for ethical information when God created one woman for the man and Christian culture understood from requirement for elders is one wife only, while perhaps acknowledging polygamy as marriage? I am aware of theonomic arguments regarding divorce. Is there anything similar? I think the next sentence would probably be concerning polygamy. Now, this is where it becomes, in my view, interesting. There are some proponents of polygamy alive today, and they have actually produced some PDFs that have been circulating for a while, and they have pretty massive structures. Now, they usually have a concomitant or an associated doctrine with them, which is equally problematic, and which I think, when tied in with the view of polygamy, sinks the whole package. But what has to happen is that there has to be a toe-to-toe debate on that issue. And if you don't have that, then those errors left uncorrected will circulate and filtrate back in. See, when we talk about a little leaven leavening the whole lump, the actual context in that passage is sin infecting every element in someone's conduct, in their heart. It's just one concession away from God, and that pollutes everything. It's kind of a toxic, pervasive effect. And so, too, the fact that there are apologetic defenses of polygamy to this day, and in this day, even more to the point, creates this tremendous challenge for the theonomists to come in and not just do what D.A. Carson calls cavalier dismissal. Cavalier dismissal means that's just nonsense, don't listen to them. And what that means is that the worldview that's represented by the opposing position is so far off base from you, you just literally, you write it off. But their position is not so easily written off. It needs to be dealt with decisively and once for all in a way that blocks the error from reintroduction, sneaking back in. Remember when Augustine and Pelagius had their debate, they resolved Pelagianism and then snuck back in as semi-Pelagianism. In other words, they learned their lessons the first time around and then structured the error in a less toxic way, if you will, and Arminianism is still present to the present day because the original error was a little bit more stronger, and then they nuanced it in such a way as that guy tried to get some traction. So too with the polygamy issue, it needs to be dealt with. Now, I actually had some back and forth with individual who had written these particular articles on men and women and the polygamy question, and in so doing, there was kind of I wouldn't say it's a standoff. Each of us thought we got a little bit better of the other, but we had not completed the discussion. It had to break off for logistical reasons. But it needs to be taken up again and dealt with again. Because I believe they're not only biblical reasons, which are the most decisive ones, of course, but there are also other reasons, one of which is the creational one. If polygamy is the standard and you have the same ratio of men to women, roughly 1-to-1, that means that if half the men could have 2 wives and the other half unmarried entirely, God providentially structured it that way that half the men would be without children. That doesn't make a lot of sense on the face of it. But there are also other biblical reasons to approach it. So what I would do then, if I were to revisit this, or if we decided this is a very good topic to take into a church council, as long as we're dealing with these other marriage issues, let's also deal with this, deal with the permanence of marriage view, the miscegenation issue, and let's also deal with the polygamy, bigamy variations, which are other ways of trying to cast doubt on heterosexual monogamous marriage as the biblical standard. So that work will probably be moved into that church council, because why is this issue still dogging our heels? Because it has never been dealt with decisively. That, and of course, there's a saying that rust never sleeps. Well, heresy never seems to sleep either. So if you are sitting on your lees and you're relaxed and calm, the enemies of God's truth are not. They are very busy. They like when they had the debates between the evolutionists and the creationists, the famous Scopes trial. It's been observed that the evolutionist side was more than willing on their own dime to roll up their sleeves and get to work busy attacking the Christian view. The Christians were sitting on their tushes. And so it's going to be the same thing today. Folks who are going to defend polygamy are going to roll up their sleeves and get to work and scratch through the scriptures point by point and try to build a case. And someone who's not trained, who's not learned to endure sound doctrine, and who has not been exposed to the opposite counter-arguments which shut it down, are going to assume, well, it looks like they go unrefuted. Maybe there's something to be said for it. Our side gave up. Well, that cannot happen. The truth can never give up. It must ride to the defense at all times, even if it's inconvenient. It certainly was inconvenient for me to spend any time on the matter, except that truth was at stake. The truth of the biblical record was at stake, and so I invested that several months of back and forth on these topics. So I am totally convinced that the Bible supports the monogamy as the standard, and especially in the New Testament era. Because if you're all to be priests, and priest of all believers is something that we talk about, then those standards for everyone being a shepherd, and no one needing to learn, we talk about these wonderful notions that repose biblical knowledge in each and every single citizen of the Commonwealth of God, then, of course, the high standard will always apply, among other things. And that's not my only argument. Someone says, well, the only argument Martin said in the Q&A was A, B, or C. I am not showing my whole deck here, nor is it appropriate for me to do that because it is a scholastic analysis and it is not something suited for ad hoc, off-the-cuff discussion here, other than to say that the work has been done, more work will be done, and it must be shut down, and I believe it is appropriate to take the issue to the Church Council and have an anathematization ruling on this notion if someone were still to teach this as the standard for Christians. Now, if you get into other questions like, well, here's some existing polygamous marriages in Africa, what do we tell the man with 2 wives? Now, you have a practical issue that you have to deal with. But that's very, very different than saying our standard is to permit this and to encourage it. Instead of us trying to come back in the African case that I just mentioned, or any place where this Western standard is not, biblical standard, has not propagated, under those circumstances, you're dealing with an existing problem, and you're going to have to work it through to eventually move away from that. And that might not be overnight, but it will move away from it because everything's going to go God's way ultimately. So I hope that answers at least the general gist. It's an important question, and it's persistent because it has not been decisively dealt with by our theologians, and the other side sensed the weakness. They moved in and started writing books, and with the internet, it's very easy to propagate an error quickly at high speed across several continents all at once, including Antarctica, for that matter, I suppose. They have internet there, too. All right, Zachary asks, so what kind of false doctrine rises to such a level where it doesn't matter if every other thing you do is right and from sound doctrine? Is this a fallacious question? Oh, that's actually a very current event kind of question, isn't it? In other words, well, we can certainly answer decisively on one point. There's certainly one doctrine where every other thing, if you're doing it right, it's not going to matter. And this is the denial that Jesus came in the flesh. This is laid out in the first letter of John. The denial of the incarnation constitutes the issue of the Antichrist. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus came in the flesh, that the Son of God was incarnated? So at that point, we do know we have a hard stop. That is a known hard stop. Now, that doesn't mean it's the only hard stop, but it certainly is one. And if there's one, we may want to make sure that there's not others that are consequent upon that. So the question is, how do we know? By study. And the study must not be shallow because we might end up throwing babies out with the bathwater. And it must pull from all sorts of areas. For example, one of the reasons that this is a current issue is this, that if you take several steps logically from a position, say someone says, I believe this position, then you can say, well, if you believe that, that infers this, and that implies that, which then leads to a position that is anti-gospel. And so therefore, with several leaps and jumps, you've made a connection. Now, what's interesting about those leaps and jumps is that nobody, perhaps prior to the 18th century, had the philosophical apparatus to make the leaps and jumps, because the terminology wasn't there yet. It took some time for understanding the science of philosophy and the science of putting all these categories together and predications and things like they call them, to be able to say this ism constitutes a form of this ism, which therefore is this ism. Deterministic materialism, say, which is anti-gospel because it reposes authority and decisiveness in genetics, which is material, and therefore is anti-covenantal, is anti-gospel. So when you make all the connections, and then you say, therefore, someone is anti-gospel, his position is anti-gospel, when taken to its logical conclusion through the steps I've outlined, then, of course, they are unfit to teach. And then we find out what? That everyone pretty much analyzed this way, because we can't be wise after the fact. If I start applying this to every person beforehand, then I might find out that not a single teacher in the church has ever been fit to teach, because they held some form of an ism that, taken to its logical conclusion, was anti-gospel. Who's the pure one? That's a tough call. Nonetheless, you have to go with the knowledge you have. Remember what the Puritan position is. As we have the light, or as God may shine further light upon it. Now, we have the advantage now that God is shining some further light upon some of these questions. And so we should take advantage of that further light. If we can say, this position, because now you can work out backwards. You say, if materialistic determinism is anti-gospel, and perhaps it leads to this, to this, to this, and this is one of the symptoms of it, then we can say, okay, now that we recognize this behavior as a symptom of a much deeper problem, now we can shed light upon it. And then that would be appropriate to at least bring the question up and not shy away from it at that stage and say, okay, something's brought to the table to our attention that perhaps cannot be dispensed with. In other words, we should not on our part also be guilty of cavalier dismissal. There may be some merit in the objection. And if so, we have to plumb the depths of it. And I don't think that is something that's quick and dirty. I think at that point, justice is not going to happen either. And God, of course, Ground Control asks, can we trust that God will not allow errors to persist? God seems to be able to use our errors, and quite very much for his benefit. And that shocks us all the time, that our falsehoods, God is able to bend them to his truth. Now, this in no way justifies the falsehood, saying, well, God was able to use my sin, and we don't want to argue like the hypothetical person does in Paul's statement, that is sin, that grace may abound. God may it never be, God forbid. That's not the way it goes. So let's make errors so God can create more truth. That's not true either. So we strive to achieve the truth. We strive to unity of the faith, an organic unity, not a doctrinal one yet. And in so doing, we finally arrive at that doctrinal unity. But yes, God does allow errors to persist. There's something else that God allows. God can allow someone like a Tertullian, who was a major church father of the 2nd century, if I recall. And he was also, he had his issues, and but he was strident and powerful, and he was kind of standing in the gap, kind of like Athanasius was to do somewhat later. And he provided an important service to the church in the service of the truth. That did not mean that his doctrines were correct. In fact, it's well said by Warfield, he died a member of a cult of one. In other words, he had so isolated himself from the rest of Christendom that he was all by himself by the end. And that did Tertullian no good, but God used Tertullian to shape the course of doctrines of Christology, etc., in a positive way, even though Tertullian ended up in Montanism. So, let us see here. Zachary, what is the biblical basis for church councils on heresy? Is there any intrinsic structural difference between, say, Chalcedon versus Paul's hardline against Gnostics? Well, the church council that was set up in Acts 15, which tends to be the model, was because of dissensions in the church. And the dissensions required resolution, because to allow them to persist was to continue to split the church instead of come together and ask God for the light to lead the best leadership of the church into the truth by seeking him, by working with one another. And so it was a very glorious thing to be able to resolve that. And they had the evidence, they heard it properly, and then James made the ruling in Acts 11. Well, that's one of the areas that was cited, but yeah, it happened in 15. But one of the things that was cited was Peter's comments in Acts 11 that then became primary evidence in Acts 15. So there's a part to play. Now, the entire church did not accept Chalcedon. The Eastern Church had a problem with it, as we well know, Eastern Orthodox and whatnot, and that therefore created a necessary divide, because the two things could not coexist. And so God's going to ultimately, in time, bring these things back together on the true point, and not on a negative. Okay, but that's a very good question. Gnosticism, of course, it wasn't just Paul's approach to Gnosticism or Judaism, the Judaizers, but also John. John was very, very strong, and his point was the Gnosticism that was there was anti-Christian in tone, and necessarily so. And here we go back to a comment made by Moses when he reports to God. The Word of God is not something on the other side of the sea that you have to hire a boat and go out there, or in the sky you have to go to the heavens to find it, or under the earth we have to dig for it. He says it's not even in your mouth. So the Gnostic position is there are certain secrets out there, and it's an esoteric tradition, and unless you are part of our unique little group, you're not going to know the truth. Chalcedon, we try to avoid any such whiff of Gnosticism by putting everything out there and saying it's all open for attack. Let's go at it. Let's go hammer and tong, deal with the Word of God, because it's an anvil that has worn out many hammers, and any mistakes that Dr. Rushdoony made, they'll come to light and be corrected. And some have, and others have stood the test of time. And those that stand the ultimate test of time will simply, all he did was say what God had said. That's what the verdict's going to be. Well done, you didn't deviate from the Word of God. It's that simple as that. But there's a biblical basis to, and because when you're going to make a church council that's going to announce an anathema, a curse upon someone holding an alternate position, it means that this situation is so severe, this doctrinal deviation is so severe that it attacks the faith at its heart. And not just that, it can attack people in the faith. The Donatist issue attacked marriages because it declared that if the pastor who performed your marriage apostatized, your marriage was rendered invalid, you're guilty of fornication, and you were charged as fornicators, even though you might have been married happily and have kids already. You retroactively had your marriage invalidated under Donatist teaching, and so the church had to deal with that. And so it's also reasonable to have a church council where you're having a similar Christendom-wide attack on valid marriages. There's one case about among many. Sean Anselmo asks, "For there must also be heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you," which is an appropriate proof text because the truth is manifested by way of contrast. Now, we don't want to then say the heretic has done us a favor, except insofar as we have sat on our lees and have grown complacent and have decided we don't need to do any more Bible study, because trust me, the heretics study their Bibles and find all these obscure little verses that can be moved into a position as weaponry against orthodoxy. So we must be ever vigilant with the Word of God, studying it deeper and deeper. Why do you think Owens, over here on my shelf to the right, spent 4,999 pages writing on Hebrews, and he still missed some stuff, as I point out in the Journal of Christian Reconstruction? He failed to put the whole quote together from Haggai 2. It's because these people were building a bulwark against error, future error as well as present error, but mostly future error. Jean Daillet, 700 pages on Colossians. That's the size of a full Bible commentary for some folks, and Daillet spends that much on just 4 chapters of Colossians. So this depth was designed to prevent people the attack. It was a tremendous battlement, and they were the Lord's. So the Puritan notion of building out and going deep in for deep foundations and outward thick walls was to protect the faith and allow the church to grow, especially in a place like America, which was a wilderness that needed that, needed the purity of the faith to not be attacked by false ideas, starting with statism as a catastrophe of enormous proportions. And now that most Christians are statists, our first and foremost allegiance is to the state and not to God. And this is one of the most supreme betrayals, treacheries that we inflict on the one who hung on the cross for us. Chalcedon Foundation asks, or says, "Today's Chalcedon Chapel Sunday service, Mark Rushdoony made the comment that if people think our times are the worst, they haven't read history correctly. Can you develop that, please?" I saw a meme today showing a child surrounded by a whole bunch of massive technology and games and stuff like that, and said, and he's complaining that he's bored, even though he has stuff that the richest people in history have never had. And so too it is at this point we have there's a reason why the apocalypticists, that is those who have a pessimistic view of eschatology and read a downward trend as hey, Jesus is coming to absolve us of responsibility. The cosmic escape hatch, the elevators getting ready to take us to the top floor, penthouse, in the heavenlies. They don't understand that the world was entirely in darkness the whole time. The whole world lieth in the evil one, we are told in 1 John. And so what's Jesus going to do? And it's also in darkness. The whole world is in darkness. And this notion of darkness is laid out in Isaiah repeatedly. In fact, in deep darkness it's used, right, as a swaddling cloth around the world. But then comes the light. Upon Galilee, the light has shone, and the Gentiles seek to the light. And the light is depicted as rising and increasing till it reaches the fullness of the day. The Son of Righteousness rising with healing in its wings. And when John gets around to this doctrine, this point, he says it in 1 John 2:8. The darkness is passing away because the true light is shining already. Warfield does an exposition of this. The King James renders that wrong based on the Vulgate Latin of Jerome. Jerome said, the darkness is past, but that's not the correct reading. Paragatai, middle voice intransitive, verb imperfect, is in process. The darkness is an actual process of passing away because the true light is shining already, and it's going to shine until it broadens into the fullness of day. That's why Jesus is the bright and shining morning star, and we are not living in a realm of increasing darkness, but rather of increasing light. Now, it took some courage of faith for John to make this observation, because here he is in Asia Minor, and all the churches are persecuted and under attack, and they lived in massive amounts of pagan, heathen darkness. And yet he says the darkness is passing away. Modern preachers, eschatology guys in particular, like to say that darkness is increasing. John says the darkness is passing away. So now we're at a crossroads. You're going to trust St. John, who wrote 1 John 5, or are you going to trust the modern preacher as your guide? I believe the modern preacher will lead you into a ditch. And so I think Mark Rushdoony was right to say we don't understand history and we don't understand the power of God either. Both these things are at a premium when we're dealing with these plain statements of Scripture that indicate this is the time of the conquest of the world. And that's being so, we are living in the primitive church era, not the last days church. A comment that Warfield and others have made. We are living in the days of the primitive church. Now, if I look at Facebook, it looks like not only primitive, but the church is in the terrible twos again. Almost as if it's a second childhood, and it's not a good thing. Except as childhood passes into maturity. How do you get to maturity? Ground Control can certainly put up that article again, The Perpetual Kindergarten. If you haven't read it, or reread it recently, it lays out, I think, a very, very strong point about an expectation laid out beginning in Hebrews 5:11 all the way to Hebrews 6:3. For the amount of time you should be teachers. Instead, you are being going back to the rudiments. In other words, you are getting your doctorate in alphabet. You're just doing the alphabet over and over and over. You're never forming sentences, paragraphs, chapters, or stories, or libraries. All you are left with is the alphabet. And this is a moral failing. The failure to mature as a Christian is a moral failing, because the word used there is nuthroi, and it is slothful. Slothfulness is a dangerous thing. It's one of the things that comes up when Jesus condemns someone in the Gospel of Matthew. Thou wicked and slothful servant. Not just wicked, but slothful servant. So a slothful servant is going to be known by what? Failing to progress in their knowledge of Christendom and Scripture, its application. We have all these tremendous tools, and we've got a great start going on, and we're not making use of it, at least by and large. Now, there are exceptions. People who are listening here are generally exceptions to the rule, and there are a lot of them out there where we don't know, in other nations where things are happening that we don't see, but they are taking the calling of Hebrews 5:11 following seriously. They are not, for the amount of time they had, going to be charged by God that they aren't now ready to be teachers. But they need to be teachers that are qualified, workmen approved, not ashamed, which means that your study must be built on the best of the past, and then with an eye to the future. Okay. Thank you for that, Ground Control. Appreciate you putting that up. All right. I want to see if there's any... were there any other questions that I missed, Ground Control? If there were, feel free to pin them. Otherwise, I'll take any others. And I hate the idea of a perpetual kindergarten. In the parlance of modern public schools, it would say, he was held back a grade. Your child was held back a grade. Well, ironically, American Christendom has been held back a grade almost every year since the advent of dispensationalism. And that's been a catastrophe for us. Nope. Well, I love it when things are unquestionable, but that's highly unlikely, isn't it? If any other questions out there, we will take them. If not, we might end up ending early today. Who knows? In the meantime, I'm going to hydrate a little. I'm going to say hi to Jay Rogers, who's listening in. People, if you are looking for a good preterist commentary on Daniel, I would very much recommend the work that Jay Rogers just published this year. It's a big, massive book, hundreds of pages, called In the Days of Those Kings, the book of Daniel in preterist perspective. Excellent volume. Gives anyone pause to think, gives you an alternative to Jim Jordan's volume, The Handwriting on the Wall, which I have over here also. So we have two contemporary things done in the 21st century that provide some expert opinion and a very useful sifting of the historical data for those who want to anchor their preterist views of Daniel, and I'm talking about orthodox preterist views, not Hymenaean stuff, into the history and anchor it. Again, I don't agree with every point. I'm not a preterist on Revelation for certain, and there's some reservations I might have on a few points that he makes, or some of the connections he makes. He and I probably have different ideas on the 70-week prophecy and how to interpret it. And that has come out recently as we're seeing disputes over how to handle some of the Olivet Discourse passages, which seem to tie into Daniel. So, all right, we're still sitting here with 0 questions, which means dead airspace, which is anathema. I don't need a church council to tell me that you're not supposed to have dead airspace on a Q&A. Ah, Sean, good man. What is biology relevant for? Rushdoony says that all parenthood is ultimately adoption, even when biological children are involved. If biology mattered at all, then a family with adopted children would treat their biological children differently than the adopted children. Do you think that is... Okay, and then he just got pinned right on top of it. I always say I can't get out of my own way either, folks, so don't take it personal. Let's start from the beginning of Sean's question. What is biology relevant for? Rushdoony says that all parenthood is ultimately adoption, even when biological children are involved. If biology mattered at all, then a family with adopted children would treat... How'd they end up getting dropped? The pin... We talked about this afterwards, saying our pinning and unpinnings, we need to work them out a little better. And today is not that day. Okay. Then a family with adopted children would treat their biological children differently than the adopted children. Do you think that is a good thing? They ought not to do that. I mean, adoption either means something or it doesn't mean something. The benefit here is that God treats us as he treats Christ himself. When he looks at us, he sees his own son. And we are the imago Dei, the image bearer of God, and he sees our benefits. He sees our sins covered by him. So it's a very, very good thing that what God models for us is no distinction between the adopted and the faithful. In fact, many times it's possible for in a family where the adopted son is the faithful one, and as Rushdoony would say, it would be necessary for the father to capitalize the godly seed. And that seed can be adopted as well as natural, native, from his own loins. And therefore he would have to disinherit his own son and not put blood over covenant. The covenant order, God's justice order, would take precedence even over the blood relation. This is the reason the Levites existed. The Levites existed because they did not put their blood relation, to others first over God's requirement. And so they were willing to slay those who defied God. They put God first over their own brothers. And that is an important thing. Luke, you ask a very interesting question. I honestly do not know the answer to that, whether we will see Saul in heaven. Part of me is suspicious, but then again, after all, it was a suicide. He fell on his own sword. That's problematic from the get-go, but that doesn't make that the unforgivable sin. But it certainly makes things a lot worse for Saul. and apart from all his other apostasies, his sins were pretty awful as a king. Yet he was, the son of Tish was picked out to lead and be the first king of Israel. And he was, in many respects, a disaster. He did not rely on God. He was so nervous when Samuel was late to the battle that he went ahead and offered the sacrifice himself. And now there he transgressed a fence that God had put in place, and he thought that he knew better than God. And that is one of the most dangerous positions you can have. So if he is there, I rejoice to see him, because obviously God's mercy exceeded my expectations, and then God be praised for that. But it would certainly be a pleasant surprise, a surprise and then a pleasant one in that order, simply because of that. And looking at Saul, I have to take into account Paul's comment, who was Saul of Tarsus, the other Saul. He was chief of sinners. So if it's possible for the chief of sinners, if we took that anywhere near literally, to be God's chosen vessel to take his gospel to the Gentiles and to be an apostle born out of season, then perhaps there's hope for Saul. But the scriptures don't speak to this one way or the other. We don't know. And in fact, it's very hard to know for a lot of folks whether we'll see them in heaven or not. In fact, when we blink our eyes, maybe some of us are self-deceived and won't be in heaven ourselves. So we'd have to scan hell and say, well, Saul's not here and with me in hell. I guess he's in heaven. And I was wrong about him and about myself. Okay. Fletcher Qualls. What's the difference between preterism in Matthew and preterism in Revelation? Where's the dividing line between orthodox, partial, and full? Well, the full preterism is pretty clear. There's not a single pending scriptural prophecy yet to be fulfilled. It has all been completed by 70 AD. There's no pending prophecy of any kind to be fulfilled. That is the full preterist position, is regarded rightly, in my view, as a heresy and a dangerous one, because it basically says God is done. You can't really have postmillennialism, because postmillennialism would be moving toward a continued conquest of the gospel until no man shall tell his neighbor, say, know the Lord, for they shall all know the Lord, and least the greatest. And so all God's enemies are destroyed and put under his feet, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death, and that would happen after there are no more living reprobates. All reprobates have either had elect offspring or passed away and their posterity cut off. We talked about this several weeks ago. So the partial preterist positions acknowledge that some of these passages were contemporaneous prophecies that Jesus was pointing to his own generation, and some were related to a different point in time. The most popular version, I disagree with it, but it's certainly popular and was sanctioned early on when Christian Reconstruction came to the fore, was that laid out by J. Marcellus Kick. He wrote a book called Matthew 24. I think it appeared first in 1948. And it was republished by P&R with a foreword by Rushdoony under the name An Eschatology of Victory. In that book, there were some lectures on short lecture sections at the beginning by Kick, followed by two big sections, the Matthew 24 exposition and the Revelation 20 exposition. And this, therefore, became kind of a powerful little book, maybe 280 pages or something, and doing a very, very good exposition, particularly of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, from a preterist point of view. Now, here's where the division is among folks that are preterist. I'm preterist with Matthew 24, but more of it than Kick was, or Bonson or some other folks. The question is, where does the passage shift gears to the future? In Kick's position, the transition text was Matthew 24, verse 35. He says, at that point, after the comment, all these things shall take place before the generation passes away. The following verse, but of that day and hour, blah, blah, that is now talking about the far future, which is yet to happen. So he divides the past, the preterist part to the distant future part at verse 35. Everything before that he sees as having already been fulfilled in the Vespasianic War in between 66 and 70 AD. The opposing position, which I would hold for and have defended at length, and it has a long history too, is that he jumped the gun. In fact, the passages, the continuation of Matthew 24 is still preterist, dealing with the first century AD situation, all the way up to Matthew 25:30. And it's not till about 2531 that the split happens, and we have the white throne judgment, and all the nations gathered before him. And this coincides then with Revelation 28:11, with the exact same thing is depicted. And so we say this unity of those passages mean that the split is actually in the wrong place. And this is supported by the parallel passages in Luke 17, in particular the passage where it says, it should be one taken and one left. In that famous passage, in a field doing this or doing that, grinding grain. He says, one taken and one left. And the disciples ask, when shall that be? And he says, where the eagle is gathered, where the carcass is, there the eagle is gathered. Well, that kind of unites these two things as simultaneous. So the Luke passage gives us a clue that, in fact, we are still dealing with first century matters all the way up to Matthew 25:30. Verse 31, now we're talking about the future. The question is, why is there such a division? It's because the disciples actually asked three questions. When shall these things be? And I have to look at the exact passage. But then the third question is in the end of the world. And it's at that point that we have an implied division, and then they're not all tied together. Let me get the exact wording on Matthew 24. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming, which is the coming in judgment on Jerusalem, and of the end of the world? So the end of the world is a separate thing from the coming at this point. It's common to conflate all these things, but the way that Jesus answers them and the ties to the passage in Revelation 20 and Luke 17 are indicative, I think, that that's the right way to split all those things out. Now, that said, Revelation can be taken one of 4 or 5 different ways. There's the well-known futurist interpretation. Almost all of Revelation is yet to happen, at least between chapters 4 and following. And it describes 7 years in the future that's erroneously tied to the 70th week of Daniel. Then there's the historicist interpretation, which believes that Revelation walks us through history, and we're somewhere in the middle of it in the advance toward the end. Rushdoony was an idealist, as was Warfield and Hengstenberg and others. And they held that there are actually 7 visions in the book of Revelation, and they all cover the same inter-advent period of time, the time between the 2 advents, describing from different aspects and facets the conquest of the world by the Messiah. Each of these passages ends in a victory, and then it rolls back to the beginning and considers the passage all over again. So that would be the approach of the idealist. And the preterists would say this is actually a depiction of the divorce of Israel, and therefore it is focused on what's going on between 66 and 70 A.D., and is the pouring out of the wrath of God on the false bride, Israel herself. And therefore the historicist then is able to see some interesting correlations as a result. Are they compelling? Maybe, maybe not. But they're worth exploring, because I believe I'm a sympathetic critic of preterism applied to Revelation, which means that I'm willing to go that route if they can make good a bunch of premises, which have yet to happen. Dr. Rushdoony, interestingly enough, he was very supportive of promoting preterist works on Revelation, even though he himself was an idealist. So he set in motion the idea that so long as there's something plausible to be said for a position, the biblical light that we can get on that must be advanced and put forward. We must do the research just to see, because if it's wrong, okay, that's fine, but at least we know we put the best possible argument for it in front of us to make the evaluation, rather than just, as we said, cavalier dismissal, writing it off because, no, it's a futurism because, helicopters are locusts, blah, blah, blah. By the way, helicopters don't have kings over them. You ever seen a king of a helicopter, which all the other helicopters pay attention to? Yeah, see, that's the thing, is that the book of Revelation is so tied in with Old Testament imagery that to fail to make all those connections, and very few scholars have, Hengstenberg was one of the few, and his work is not perfect, but at least he gave us a tremendous tent stake in the ground in regard to interpreting the Old Testament elements of it. We have this passage about these locusts in Revelation 9. It says, and the locusts have a king over them. His name is Apollyon, or in the Hebrew tongue, Abaddon. But if you roll back to Proverbs 30:27, we read, the locusts have no king. So we know for one thing, these aren't locusts in the normal sense. They're probably a symbol for demons, in fact. In fact, the locusts don't come from out of the sky. They come out of the abyss. The cloud comes out of the abyss, and the locusts come down. Lots of times people don't pay any attention to the details. They go, well, those details get in the way of my selling this expensive sensationalist book on why the Messiah is coming down any moment, and his toes are going to touch the Mount Olive, and it's going to tear him to pieces. Things like this. So, in order to sell a sensationalistic book, you have to set aside all the things that get in the way of the hypothesis. All right. So, those are the main views on Revelation. There's also a fifth view called the apocalyptic view, which basically says the whole thing is imagery, in effect, and we don't necessarily seek any implementation in history, per se. At least in the case of the other four views, idealist, historicist, preterist, futurist, the imagery, we always say that it's dealing with things that are going to be real. They're either real in the first century, as for the preterist, real in the future for the futurist, or real throughout history for the idealist or the historicist. In the case of the apocalypticist, it's not. It's supposed to be wild, fantastic imagery to create an impression about God's holiness and God's anger with sin, and that's about it. All right. Sean asks, dovetailing on Luke's question, do you believe that there is a biblical case, one way or another, as to whether or not someone who commits suicide can be born again? I've seen both sides of that question, and I don't think it's been resolved successfully yet. The main argument saying that it may not be a dead end, I didn't mean that pun to come out, is that it's not the unforgivable sin. So in principle, it does not rise to that level. However, the schoolmen in their casuistry in the Middle Ages developed a very lengthy rationale for why that was a big problem. To be a suicide was self-murder, and they took that to the last degree of precision in their analysis, but it still remains an open question for the reasons given. You see, arguments, and this is what I'm going to quote Warfield, when he looked at an argument and he opposed it, he says, now what is the problem with this argument? It is that it argues from a premise divorced from its companion premises. So he says you need to have all the premises on the table to make the argument fly. This is why the Sadducees and the Pharisees continually had grief with Jesus. Jesus would complete the argument when they would only show a piece of it. They would take one piece and run with it, and Jesus said, and then he would explain the whole thing. He would wind them back to the whole counsel of God, to every applicable jot and tittle. And so that's the same thing here. The question would have to be resolved, if it should ever be resolved this side of the final judgment, before we actually see face-to-face what the situation is. It was going to be resolved by a theological analysis. It's going to be when all the factors are brought into place, and not just proof-texted abruptly, saying, well, here's a proof text, and that's all we need to go on. Boom. Well, a lot of proof texts fall apart. I just pointed one out just now, did I not? Hey, look at this locust king in Revelation 9. Except, oops, there is no king over the locust, according to Proverbs 30:27. And Jesus said the scripture cannot be broken. So therefore, our theology must expand to accommodate the fact that God doesn't often fit in the box he's trying to squeeze him into. And his word, I always cite this passage in Psalm 119:96b. That commandment is exceeding broad. I've seen it into all perfection, but that commandment is exceeding broad. In other words, it extends and deals with everything. It's an amazing thing. Okay. Sean's is the last question for today. The questions should be sent, like I said, to ask.chalcedon@chalcedon.edu. I hope you all got to participate in the Chariots of Prophetic Fire Book of the Month Club that prevailed last Monday. If not, I believe I see it is up on the website. So definitely want to plug in and listen to Tim Yarbrough's discussion with Andrea Schwartz on this amazing book by Rushdoony. I don't know what the next week's is, but we will next month's, but we will have one next month as well. And in the meantime, we appreciate your support over at Chalcedon, and feel free to donate anytime you want, because we want to keep the work going forward. We think there's a lot of spade work and foundation digging yet to be done. People who are telling you we're just going, all that's left is to put some tiles on top of the roof. We're putting in the capstone now. I think that's a big mistake. we are still doing the foundational work. This is still the era of the primitive church. We're making all the mistakes that we could possibly make at this point in time, and therefore excessive care is required so that we don't exceed our allotment of mistakes before God says, I'm going to put someone else on the wall to build it. Every brick you put in has been crooked. So to that end, let's pray that God allows us to put in our bricks straight and true. Oh, great, yes. Next month will be This Independent Republic. Mark Rushdoony will lead with Andrea Schwartz hosting. So until then, we'll see everyone next week. God bless you all. Oh, one more thing. In June, we'll probably have a Q&A where I'll have one or two guests with me. And so we're planning that out. It'll probably be the last Sunday of June. So once I let you know who the guests are, you might want to pose some questions that are appropriate for who I will have on camera with me. We'll be broadcasting down south in Austin proper, not in Georgetown. God bless you all. Talk to you soon. Bye.